His name was Kofi Mensa, and he was the kind of man the village whispered about. Not with fear exactly, but with the quiet reverence people reserve for lightning. He was the best hunter the settlement of Aduanese had ever known. From the age of 9, he could track a forest buffalo through 3 days of rain. By 15, he had provided more meat than any elder twice his age. By 30, his name was both blessing and warning. Kofi, who walks where spirits sleep. But greatness has a hollow place at its center, and Kofi had found his. The village boundary, that invisible line where firelight ended and ancient darkness began, had started to feel like a cage. Other men saw the forest edge and turned back. Kofi stood at it each morning and felt a pull he could not name, like a drum beating just below the frequency of human hearing. He had fed his people, he had honored his ancestors, and still, something in the deep wood called to him, patient and old as the earth itself. On the morning of the dry season's last breath, he crossed the boundary that no hunter of Aduanese had crossed since his grandfather's grandfather walked the land. He told no one, he packed no extra yam, he took his bow, his iron knife, and the reckless certainty of a man who mistakes hunger for courage. The shift was immediate. Within 50 paces, the air changed. It was not cooler, it was older. The light filtering through the canopy above moved differently, bending at angles that made no sense to a sky that was clear. Insects that should have scattered at his footfall instead turned toward him in formation, watching. The deeper Kofi walked, the more his footsteps began to make no sound at all, as if the forest were swallowing the evidence of his presence. And then he saw her. She stood at the edge of a stream that should not have existed. No map of this land showed water here. No elder had ever mentioned it. She was dressed in bark and mist, her skin the color of deep mahogany lacquered by centuries of moonlight. Her hair moved without the wind. Her eyes, when they found his, were not the eyes of a woman who had been startled. They were the eyes of a creature that had been waiting, patiently, the way a trap waits. Kofi, who had faced leopards without blinking, felt his blood drop to his feet, because he understood immediately, with the instinct that separates survivors from the dead, that he was not the predator here. He was not even the hunter. He was a prey who had stumbled into a clearing and mistaken stillness for safety. She did not speak. She tilted her head, and in that gesture, Kofi Mensa's fate was sealed. If you feel the pull of the forbidden, keep watching. The worst is yet to come. The elders had a word for what Kofi did next, ininyam. It meant loosely the madness of a man who has seen something too beautiful to survive. He did not run. He did not raise his bow. He walked toward her step by deliberate step, until he stood close enough to see that she cast no shadow. He asked for her hand, not with words, with his knife, which he drew slowly and pressed against his own palm, letting blood fall into the stream between them. An offering, a proposal older than language. The forest went absolutely silent, not the comfortable silence of dusk, but the arrested silence of a world holding its breath. She accepted, not with warmth, with acknowledgement, like the ocean acknowledging a stone thrown into it. The price was presented to him not in speech, but in sensation. He felt it first in his chest, a hollowing, as though something essential had been lifted out of him and placed on a high shelf he could never reach again. Later, he would understand what had been taken, the thread connecting him to his ancestral lineage. No children would carry his name. No grandchildren would pour libations over his grave. His bloodline, that sacred chain stretching back generations, ended in that clearing beside a stream no cartographer would ever find. He paid it without hesitation, which was itself the first symptom of how deeply he had already been changed. They walked together back through the forest, she moving between the trees as though she were made of the same material, he crashing through brush like the human thing he still technically was. When they arrived at the village boundary, she stopped. She looked at the firelight and the mud brick homes and the children chasing chickens across the red dirt, and something moved across her face that was not quite contempt. It was more like how a scientist looks at a petri dish, curious, uninvested. The village would remember that evening, not for any celebration, but for the cold that descended the moment she crossed the boundary, a cold with no meteorological explanation. Dogs refused to bark, fires burned lower, old women pulled their grandchildren inside without knowing why their hands would not stop shaking. Kofi brought a forest spirit home to Aduanasi, and from that first night, nothing was ever simply warm again. Share this story with someone who needs to understand. Not everything beautiful is safe. Not everything desired is wise. They lived in a hut at the village's edge, which was as far inside the human world as she would go, and as far outside it as Kofi could bear. He built the walls himself. He covered the floor with woven grass mats. He hung dried herbs from the rafters because he had learned from his mother that a home needs smell as much as structure. She stood in the center of the room and looked at it all with those ancient eyes, and she was neither grateful nor ungrateful. She was simply present, the way the weather is present, a force that doesn't require your approval to exist. The domestic friction began immediately and never ceased. Kofi needed fire. She tolerated it, but sat as far from it as the room allowed, her skin luminous in the dark in ways that made the firelight seem amateur. He needed food, the protein, fat, and grain that kept a human body operational. She did not eat. Not the yam he roasted, not the soup he spent 3 hours preparing from memory of his mother's recipe. She would sit across from him while he ate, watching with the focused attention of something studying a phenomenon it found mildly interesting. And the silence was a third presence in the room, large and old and utterly indifferent to his comfort. He began to change. It happened slowly enough that the villagers noticed before he did. He started leaving food half-eaten. He began rising before dawn and standing at the edge of the forest, staring into it with an expression people could not read. He stopped attending the evening fire gatherings, where men told stories and women braided hair, and children fell asleep against their grandparents' legs. He stopped laughing, not suddenly, but gradually, the way a river loses water to drought, so incrementally that you don't see the disaster until the riverbed is cracked earth. His oldest friend, a farmer named Kwame, came to the hut one afternoon and found Kofi sitting cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, barely breathing. On the mat beside him, the forest spirit sat equally still. 2 figures in perfect stillness, except that her stillness was natural and his was the stillness of a man suppressing his own nature through enormous, exhausting effort. Kwame left without speaking. He went home and told his wife that Kofi was being digested, not by an animal, by something that had no stomach, which made it worse. And still Kofi stayed, because whatever he had given up, his lineage, his laughter, his belonging, he had received something in return. In the moments when she looked at him directly, truly looked, he could feel the entire weight of the forest's ancient consciousness pressing against his mind. He knew things no human should know, where the rains were moving 3 seasons ahead, which plants held medicine undiscovered by any herbalist, what the animals dreamed in the deepest part of the night. He was being filled with the forest's secrets, even as he was being emptied of himself. He told himself this was a fair trade. He told himself this so many times that he almost believed it. Has someone ever changed you so completely that you no longer recognized yourself? This is that story. Keep watching. Every spirit marriage has a condition. This is not superstition, it is physics. When two incompatible forces attempt to occupy the same space, there must be a rule that keeps them from destroying each other. Kofi's condition had been communicated not in words, but in a bone-deep knowing that had settled into him the moment their union was sealed. He must never follow her when she walked back into the forest at night. She left every night, without farewell, without explanation. She simply walked to the edge of their hut, stepped into the darkness beyond the village boundary, and disappeared. And every night, Kofi lay on his mat and stared at the roof and did not follow. For 2 years, he kept the condition. For 2 years, the arrangement held its terrible, beautiful equilibrium. It was his own curiosity that broke it, not malice, not greed, just the most human thing in the world, the need to know what he was not supposed to know. On the night of the 3rd dry season, when the moon was absent and the village was sealed in the particular darkness that comes before everything changes, Kofi followed her. He was careful, he kept his distance, he moved with all the hunter's skill he possessed, placing each foot with surgical precision, controlling his breath, becoming the forest's shadow. What he found in the deep thicket was not a meeting of spirits or a secret ritual or any of the things his human imagination had constructed to explain her nightly absences. What he found was simply her, existing, standing in a clearing with her arms open and her face tilted upward, completely still, absorbing the darkness the way a tree absorbs light. She was not doing anything. She was being, and what she was being was so fundamentally not human, so ancient and vast and cold and magnificent that Kofi's mind fractured slightly at the sight of it. He made a sound, one sound, a single sharp exhale of breath, the involuntary noise of a mind encountering something it cannot contain. She turned, and in her eyes, Kofi saw, for the first and last time, something he could recognize: loss. Not anger, not power, just the quiet sorrow of a thing that had tried to bridge an unbridgeable gap and had just received confirmation that the gap was indeed unbridgeable. The forest responded before she moved. The trees closed their paths. The stream reversed direction. The air thickened to something just below breathable. Around Kofi, the sounds of the living wood shifted from neutral to hostile, a register so subtle that any human less attuned than he had become would have missed it. But he heard it clearly. He heard it the way you hear a door lock from the inside. The moment of no return. If you know someone who needs this warning, share this now before the ending arrives. She walked back through the trees without looking at him again, not in cruelty, in conclusion, the way a wound closes, the way a season ends. She walked back into the forest, and the forest closed around her, and Kofi stood in the clearing alone for the first time in 2 years, and what he felt was not grief exactly. It was the feeling of a man who has been holding a burning coal and has just released it. The relief and the pain arriving simultaneously, indistinguishable from each other. He returned to the village. He returned changed in ways that took years to fully reveal themselves. He never hunted again, not because he lost the skill, but because the animals looked at him differently now, with the recognition of something that had stood in the deep forest at night and seen what should not be seen. He lived on the edge of Aduanese for the rest of his days, neither fully of the village nor of the forest, haunting the boundary the way a ghost haunts the place of its own dying. The hut at the village's edge stood empty for a generation. No one burnt it down, no one moved in. The wood simply returned to the forest, slowly, incrementally, a vine here, a root there, until 20 years after Kofi's union ended, there was no hut, Only a slight clearing where the grass refused to grow in the shape of a dwelling that once held something the world was not built to contain. The village never spoke of it directly, but mothers told their children in voices that allowed no argument to stay on the known paths, to not follow curiosity into places that have not invited you, to understand that the forest gives meat, gives medicine, gives shelter, gives rain, but that it gives these things on its own terms, and any attempt to own what the forest lends will result in the forest collecting its debt, with interest, in a currency you did not know you are spending. Kofi's story was not a tragedy because he loved something beyond his reach. Tragedy is passive. His story was a warning precisely because his ruin was built from his greatest strengths, his courage, his hunger, his refusal to accept the limits that kept other men safe. The very gifts that made him exceptional were the tools the forest used to dismantle him. Which brings us to the question the elders never asked aloud, but always let hang in the air above a fire dying down to coals. If you are Kofi, with his hunger, his skill, his magnificent and ruinous ambition, would you have stayed on the path? The forest is still out there, older now, patient as always. The paths it has closed remain closed. The secrets it keeps remain kept. And somewhere between the firelight of what is known and the darkness of what calls to you from beyond the boundary, every human being alive right now is standing exactly where Kofi stood on that first morning, one step from what they should not cross, feeling the pull, deciding. The forest does not warn. The forest does not beg. The forest simply waits for you to make your choice, and then it responds with a completeness and a permanence that no human institution has ever matched. Some paths are closed because they are dangerous. Some are closed because they lead somewhere the human body can walk, but the human soul cannot follow. And some, the rarest, the most devastating, are closed because a man once opened them with blood and recklessness and love that the universe itself could not accommodate, and the forest sealed them shut again, so that no one else would have to learn what he learnt in that clearing in the dark. That there are things in this world more ancient than desire, more patient than grief, and more final than the choices we make when we are certain we know better than the wild. The forest remembers everyone who watches this. Share this tale before you leave. Tag someone who needs this warning. Comment below. Would you have followed her into the dark? Like and subscribe. The forest has more stories waiting. The path closes behind you. It always does.